This unlikely looking farmland landscape has thrown up evidence of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, evidence that has forever changed our understanding of life in the Mesolithic. And there's one item discovered here that has gripped my imagination like no other. The world's oldest complete bow, unearthed here in Yorkshire 10 years ago. It's the earliest evidence we have of archery here in Britain. And it serves as the starting point of a long and rich relationship with the bow. In this series, I'm going to be uncovering the history of the bow from its early use in hunting.
That is really, really brilliant.
To its development as the first true weapon of mass destruction. But the amount of violence is staggering, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Join me as we discover how this one weapon helped to define our island nation. What's it going to be then, Joe?
How about the green patch?
That green bush?
Yeah, green bush.
Long shot?
Longest shot, yeah.
2 arrows?
Yeah, let's do 2.
Unless it's fun, and then maybe we do 3.
All right, okay. This is roving. This is the old way of practicing with a bow. This is what our ancestors did prior to Agincourt, battles like that. Men would go out into the countryside, and a bit like a round of golf, they pick marks and take shots at them. Whoever gets closest picks the next mark. It's very competitive, it's good fun. And of course the marks uphill, downhill, into the light behind you, short, far. It made for very accurate archers, and that was part of the secret of turning these into sticks that we could stand behind as a nation.
Nice little puff.
How are we doing, guys?
All right. Nice one off Joe there, nice little puff of soil, look good.
It's moments like this, in the field, when the distance between now and then seems to shorten. And the lives of our distant ancestors become tangible.
I'm really looking forward to this journey. For me, traditional archery was a very big part of my life for more than 30 years. I'm a bit rusty, so it's going to be good to pull a bowstring again. But you know, archery is special. I've had the opportunity to travel amongst hunter-gatherer communities around the world who still use a bow to find their food on a daily basis. And I've discovered that there is a fraternity of the bow amongst those who use it. They love to compete with it. It's great fun. This is a medieval style longbow, quite different to modern target archery, but we're still all archers together. And I like to think that if I could be standing here amongst my ancestors from 10,000 years ago, they would recognize this equipment too. They'd come over, we'd have a chat about the equipment that we're using. We'd compare our bows and our arrows, maybe compete a little. That's part of the magic of the subject. And here in Britain, we have a unique historical heritage associated with the longbow.
The oldest known evidence of the use of the bow comes from South Africa, where microliths, believed to be arrowheads dating from around 70,000 years ago, have been found. Evidence of humans' use of the bow can be found all over the world, from cave art in Algeria that shows a man shooting a slightly curved bow, to the mummified body of Ötzi, the iceman, a 4,000-year-old murder victim discovered in the Alps with an arrowhead embedded in his shoulder.
We're very lucky to have the oldest complete bow ever found here in Britain. In fact, to be precise, it was found in Yorkshire at a remarkable archaeological site called Star Carr.
The bow discovered at Star Carr is held here at the Yorkshire Museum. Archaeologist Professor Nicky Milner is making it possible for me to take a close look at this remarkable find. Made of willow wood, the 11,000-year-old bow is extremely delicate and can only be removed from protective storage for short periods of time.
Nikki, some years ago you asked me to collaborate with you really for an opinion on whether this piece of wood, which is amazing, is a bow. Is this the item?
That is correct, yes.
And you sent me all the drawings and I wasn't 100% certain, I was sort of 89% certain, but now I see it in the flesh. I'm 100% certain this is a bow.
Great. Well, this is what we think is the oldest complete bow in the world.
Amazing. And it's very delicate. It's a rat tail bow. Pointy, it would have been pointy, I think, at both ends. But in terms of the development of the bow, this is right at the beginning of that period.
That's right, yes. I mean, we know that bows and arrows are used in the Paleolithic before this, but this gives us an insight into the Mesolithic period and how they're hunting and how this matches up with the microliths that we find, which were used in arrows. I think what was surprising for us is just how slender it was. You know, a lot of later bows are a lot larger.
And I know that you were planning to reconstruct it.
That's right, yes.
Have you managed to do that?
We have done that. We have a reconstruction here.
Here we are.
Wow, here we go. Look at that. That's great. Well, that really brings this object to life. That's amazing. So what you've got here is like that there, and then this bit is at the other end there with a little bit missing. It's fantastic that, you know, that brings it to life, doesn't it?
I don't think this would be used for killing deer, would it?
No, I don't think so. I think, but a young hunter, perhaps a boy learning to hunt, could use this to hunt small game birds, songbirds. You know, it's a horrible thought for us today, but they didn't have a supermarket as we do. And perhaps the arrows were reeds. It would have to be something very light but quite stiff. And given the right arrow matched to the bow, you'd get longer range than that. It'll be rat tail bows like this are really quite pokey as bows to fire. They can really shoot. That's so exciting. Seeing those items in the flesh was amazing. It's quite clear that the people who were at Star Carr were investing an awful lot of time in their production. These weren't just everyday items. They must have had massive cultural significance. One of Britain's most important archaeological sites, Star Carr, yielded superb finds from the Mesolithic era 11,000 years ago. The excavations uncovered a series of incredibly rare organic objects: headdresses made from red deer skulls, modified fungi, harpoon points, as well as a variety of carefully crafted flint tools, including arrowheads. Today I'm meeting archaeologist Dr. Barry Taylor, who's leading a new dig nearby.
So we've only been here a couple of days, so we've only just opened up our trenches. But what we're looking for is evidence for early Mesolithic occupation, contemporary with Star Carr, hopefully, in this sort of like lake edge sort of shoreline and zone.
And Nikki was explaining you're more likely to find organic materials in the peat.
Yes, that's
so
right.
Although people almost certainly were camped up on top, this is the place where you might, fingers crossed, find the exciting stuff.
Definitely, yes, and we already have. So there's some really nice flint blades like this one.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's really nice, isn't it? So a lot of material like that, and it's sort of scattered. It's following a line along roughly what would have been sort of the lake water level, so just where the water's sort of reaching the shore.
Right on the shoreline.
Yeah.
So how many thousand years ago, is this contemporaneous with Star Carr?
Yeah, it should be certainly within a few centuries of sort of, within the same sort of span of occupation of Star Carr.
Wow.
Yeah.
So somebody sat here on the shoreline and struck this little blade, long, beautiful blade, delicately from a flint core. What have you learned about our ancestors from digging in the peat?
Well, they have very rich lives. There is this idea that hunter-gatherers, particularly early prehistoric hunter-gatherers, are sort of living on the edge of starvation. That idea that people who don't farm are living hand to mouth. And I think when you see sites like Star Carr and sites like this, yeah, these people are living quite comfortably. They're certainly very accustomed. They're very good at what they do. and really being sort of tuned to the sort of, I suppose, that rhythms of the sort of like of the natural environment. Really, it's that for me, I think, is the thing that comes out most.
Star Carr particularly has been astonishing. It has thrown a window on the lives of our hunter-gatherers. It is quite remarkable. There's the earliest evidence for carpentry in Europe. There is the astonishing ritual behaviour. There's the ornamentation that was discovered there. But particularly for me, I'm interested in the spotlight that it has shone on the methods employed by the hunter-gatherers themselves for hunting game.
Inspired by the excavation, I've come to the nearby York Experimental Archaeological Research Centre. Using Mesolithic-style tools and materials, I'm going to try making something myself. But it's not my first time here.
This is a replica of one of the artefacts from Star Carr that was found in the 1940s. This was thought for many years, well, for decades, to be a paddle, although, as you can see, it's very small. But I remember as soon as you saw it in the museum on display, you said that's not a paddle and a bow. And you came, and you came back and we had a go at making this replica bow.
And this is what we made that day.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, now when I look at it, it looks unfinished. But we didn't have very much time, did we?
No.
I said at the time, it would be nice to make an arrow to match this bow, because the arrow we shot on the day was way too heavy for this bow.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe being here, we would have a go at that. What do you think?
That would be great.
I have already straightened a birch shaft here a few days ago. And if I bounce this off this piece of wood, hopefully, you hear that ringing sound.
Yeah.
That shows you how good this is. It's a really good wood. It gives a real ping. And so now it's really quite sharp, quite straight, and we need to start working it down. I'm going to put the point on the heavier end.
Using a flint blade I've made, I'm going to start smoothing the arrow shaft.
It's a real skill then, isn't it, to get it?
The arrow is underestimated, how complicated an arrow is to make and make well. In fact, medieval arrows are better than modern bought arrows.
Then I'll switch to a sandstone that I picked up at the dig site. This helps to shape and taper the head of the shaft.
Now the next stage, we have to put a knock in the tail of the arrow, and we have to fit the point.
I'm going to use a burin for this task. It's an ancient version of a chisel.
And it gives very good control on the wood.
Yeah. Better than just a blade, which is...
Yes, better than just... It's quicker too.
Now I will saw the nock for the bowstring.
How deep does it have to go? Does it have to go a lot more than that?
Yeah, it's got to go all the way in.
All the way through.
It's got to go all the way in. It has to be very careful not to split wood at that point, once we get to that point. Okay. That's now done.
That's amazing.
Now we've got to fit our microliths to the arrow.
A secure grip for the arrowhead.
And I find what's interesting as well is that when you do this, you realise how precise people in the past were.
The arrow I'm making today will feature 2 blades, one for the tip, for piercing, and another on the side to cause greater hemorrhaging.
While you're doing that, I've finished the notches, and the wood is actually grasping the point.
Oh, wow.
So you gain some idea of what this is going to look like when it's done.
Next I form the fletching from kestrel feathers.
We're now in the lap of the gods. We don't know how the arrows here were made. I really hope that you will uncover one in the future and be able to answer these questions. We do know that the majority of arrows found in prehistory were bound on with sinew, with tendon fibres. But one of the most complete archery sets from prehistory, although much later period, was of course the archery equipment that the iceman had. And what was fascinating is that he was using nettle fibre. And I wonder whether that might not also have been done in the Mesolithic. I thought, as an experiment, maybe we would give that a go.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And we have, and again, nettles are found at Star Carr, so it's not impossible at all.
If you soften it with your thumbnail, it becomes good. Sometimes people don't do this, and if you leave the nodes, they're weak spots, but by just using a thumbnail on the dry fibre, you remove that and they become viable fibres. And I've moistened the fibres, which makes them more gummy.
I'm creating a loose attachment to position the feathers, then I'll tightly bind them with nettle fibres.
Well, there we go. I've put the barbs back together, and there is the fletching done. And you can see the nettle fibre is really strong, and now it's bound the fletching on all the way up. There's no need for adhesive. Making the fibres damp, they will actually glue together with some of the chemicals that are within the fibres. So now we have one job left, which is to attach the points.
To attach the points, I will use birch tar, a Mesolithic glue similar to pine resin but much stronger.
Birch is, it's useful in lots of different ways, isn't it? For this bow, they used birch, and they used the tar and the.
Birch was quite literally the tree of life.
I'll wrap the points with nettle fibres, heat the tar, and then use it to bind the arrowhead.
There we go, finished arrow. My interpretation of what the Star Carr arrows may have been like. We can't be certain about any of this, but it is certainly possible. This, on the other hand, the arrowhead, we've got pretty good evidence from other parts of the world. But this was just the beginning of Britain's involvement with archery. It was a long and interesting history.
It was a long journey from the bows of our hunter-gatherer ancestors to the war bow of medieval Europe. Birch, a key material, was replaced by stronger, better suited woods like yew, wych elm and ash. Items used to create bowstrings would change from animal sinews to hemp or flax and linen. To explore how the bow developed from the Mesolithic into the Middle Ages, I've come to meet Todd, an engineer who specialises in making historically accurate tools and weapons.
Well, that's a fine sight. Two Englishmen practising at the butts. That's a piece of history in its own right.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yep.
It's a lovely sight to see. I thought you might like to see this. This is a Mesolithic style arrow. This is what our ancestors were hunting with 10,000 years ago. It's a bit mysterious because at that period people made tiny, tiny stone tools and glued them in.
It's still going to work viciously. I mean, it's a one-strike object. If you need to reset the head after, it doesn't matter.
But how do we get from this to medieval bows? That's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's a big step up.
Well, Joe, can you pull one of your arrows out, actually?
So this is sort of like a getting on towards late Tudor sort of thing.
Look at that.
So that's basically when arrows stop being a functional battlefield weapon.
What would be really good would be to explore the journey from this, one of the earliest, maybe the earliest form of hunting arrow, to this, the absolute, the zenith of military archery.
Well, it's not a straight line, but if we go to the workshop, I can show you roughly where we're going with
Brilliant.
it. Right.
Oh, here we are. Got a great workshop.
So that's the arrow that Joe was shooting now. Let's say around 1540, 1550. But we start at the beginning with your Mesolithic.
Yep.
For me, what I'm seeing there is absolutely razor sharp edges.
Yep.
So that is 10,000 odd years ago.
Yep.
And then, of course, the Stone Age ends and the Bronze Age starts.
Yep.
Now, bronze we think of as being softer than iron, but actually you can still make razors out of it. You can still make blades plenty sharp enough. So in some respects, you might say that bronze arrowheads or iron arrowheads, there's not really any difference. You end at the end of the Stone Age, and then you're into the land of metals, time of metals. You enter an arms race now, and it becomes a race between the bows and the arrows and the armour. The first arrow that we have here, in fact, is this one, which is a Saxon. So let's just say that that's from around the year 950. Beautiful. 900, 950. Yeah. So you've got a leaf-shaped head, nice strong rib in the centre. Now, these arrowheads are going to be iron. And one of the reasons that you have a strong rib is it gives good support because the material itself is really very soft.
Yeah. Beautifully made, though.
And then the next arrowhead we've got here is a Norman-style one. So let's say from the, Battle of Hastings-ish.
And this is very much a hunting style arrowhead as well.
That sort of hunting and warfare is probably largely, the heads are largely indiscriminate. It hasn't specialised yet.
Yep.
But again, you can see a lot of parallels with the earlier Saxon head. With that Norman
They're
one.
very much so. Of course, there's one more item than any other that has helped shed much light on this period, the Bayeux Tapestry. Completed after the Battle of Hastings, the tapestry not only helps to tell the story of William's conquest, but provides a unique glimpse into how war was waged and what it was fought with.
Joe, you are uniquely qualified to tell us about the bows because you are an extraordinary bowyer, as I can see. Tell me about the history of the bow. I mean, we've got such a long history, don't we, of military archery in Britain. And infamously, perhaps the story that most people are familiar with was when our King Harold was felled by an arrow at the Battle of Hastings. What sort of archery equipment was being used back then?
So you'd have a yew bow, roughly the same draw weight as the one we're going to use today. So sort of 70, 80 pounds. For our testing today, this one is going to be pretty much similar to what they would have used at that period.
So we can see it in action and gauge what the arrows were capable of doing.
Yeah.
So let's explore then the sort of draw weight that was being used at the time of the Battle of Hastings.
Okay.
The draw weight, measured in pounds, indicates how much force is needed to draw the bow to an anchor position. The higher the weight, the harder it is for someone to pull and the more strain the bow can take.
I guess this is a moment of truth in a strange way. So you've got the scale set up. What draw weight length are you going for here?
For just 28 inches
28,
on this one,
because that's what they were doing in
Probably,
those days.
yeah, slightly shorter than later periods.
Okay. And you've got a marker on that will hold on the maximum draw weight.
Yeah.
Because this is what a lot of people won't realise. This is a nervous moment for you as a bowyer, isn't it? Because when the bow is at full draw length, it's at its most vulnerable.
Exactly, I'm hanging under it. Obviously use my body weight to pull it because it's that heavy. And if it breaks, I'm not in a good position.
I'm going to stand back because if it does break, they go off with some force.
For bowyers like Joe, this is a tense moment. Any weakness in his craftsmanship could see the bow shatter.
Okay. Well, you're above 70. It looks like 74, 75 pounds draw weight. That's a really healthy draw weight on that bow.
Yeah, a bow like this can be shot fairly accurately, so it's what you're wanting really at that time.
With Joe's bow having passed the test, we took a look at the other quickly developing technology, armour.
So we've got a 75-pound bow in Joe's hands that we don't know that's the kind of weight they had, but it's probably more that than 130.
Yep.
So that feels about good weight for hunting. We've got some Saxon arrows, nice leaf-shaped head on there. And we're going to see what they do against the male.
Okay.
No pressure.
Right, let's give them a bit of space. Well, that's the answer.
That would hurt. Oh, ouch. Well, that's pretty definitive. I mean, this could have hit brachial artery, couldn't it? But there's no surgeon of the day could fix that injury.
No, there's no question there. And also, it couldn't even luckily have missed something. That is right square where your stomach and your guts are.
Yeah.
Having seen what Joe could do with his bow against male, it was my turn.
I'm not sure I can even pull it back these days. So long since I've done any of this. So. That's quite tasty, isn't it?
That is about as good as it gets. Lovely.
You wouldn't want to charge on to that.
No.
You can see why an army of well-trained English archers was going to be a formidable force.
To discover how the bow was used to claim a victory that would change the course of English history forever, I've come to the most famous battlefield in England, Hastings.
In the year 1066, one of the most significant battles in British history was fought here at Battle. It is, of course, the Battle of Hastings between William of Normandy and the Saxon king Harold. I've come here today to explore the role that archery played on that fateful day.
It was here that the two opposing armies led by the Anglo-Saxon king Harold of England and William, Duke of Normandy, would meet to decide the fate of England. King Harold and his forces arrived here on the 13th of October, just a day before the battle. Exact figures will never be known, but it's believed Harold's army numbered between 7,000 and 8,000 troops and consisted almost entirely of infantry. On the other side, William's force comprised a similar number, but included a significant force of archers. I'm meeting with historian Mark Morris, a man who has spent his life working to uncover the events of that fateful day.
So, Mark, tell me what we know of the battle itself.
Well, for a battle that happened nearly 1,000 years ago, we are incredibly well informed. We've got three closely contemporary sources. We've got famously the Bayeux Tapestry. I mean, 70 metres of embroidery that survives almost a millennium of potential destruction. We've got that, and we've got two very, very full written accounts, page after page after page, written by people who lived through those events.
So, we've got the Norman army, which has recently invaded. They've come from France, geared up, ready for this big battle. That's what they want, a definitive battle. And you've got Harold, who's arrived from Stamford Bridge, where he's just had a massive battle with the Danish army. How did they line up against each other? What were their strengths and weaknesses?
Going back to our contemporary sources, William of Poitiers, very well informed, he says William had his army drawn up in three divisions, three ranks. At the front, he says, were the archers. Behind them were the heavily armed foot soldiers. So he says kind of men with helmets and hauberks and armed with spears and swords. Behind them was the cavalry. Because the Normans, of course, unlike the Anglo-Saxons, the English, they are sort of masters of the cavalry charge. The English have horses, of course, but to the disbelief almost of the continental chroniclers, they say they turned up on their horses and then they dismounted and stood to fight.
So we know the Normans have got archers. Did the Saxons have archers?
Well, this is the thing. The French sources go into great detail about their deployment. With the English, they basically say they all stood in a line forming the shield wall. There's only one shred, tiny scrap of evidence for archers on the English side. There is a solitary bowman in the Bayeux Tapestry. There's also, very interestingly, the Norman chroniclers disparage the military abilities of the English, and they say these are weak people, these are militarily incompetent people, a people that doesn't even have arrows. This kind of becomes a repeated phrase in later chronicles.
The legend goes that Harold was felled with an arrow to the eye. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it's a tough one, the arrow in the eye. I mean, the reason the arrow in the eye is famous is because it's depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry. In the 20th century, people started to look again at the tapestry and sort of pick it to pieces and said, is this figure actually Harold? Is Harold, a man slightly further along? Does he really have an arrow in the eye? Because the tapestry was restored in the 19th century and bits and pieces were added in a way that, it wouldn't be done nowadays. The problem is that it's an artistic interpretation of the event. No other contemporary source of the ones I mentioned says he was killed in that way. We have the song, The Battle of Hastings, which describes a completely different death for Harold. of him being deliberately done in by a Norman death squad who ride up and surround him and chop him to pieces. So no mention of an arrow in our most closely contemporary written source.
So we can't be certain of how Harold died. But what we see here is perhaps the first demonstration of what happens if you don't have sufficient archers with you.
The fact that Harold rushed down here, I mean, Harold has, you know, this desire always to take people by surprise, and it backfires on this occasion spectacularly, because William is forewarned of his coming, and William's been planning this for months. William has got squadrons of cavalry, squadrons of heavy infantry, and squadrons of archers.
And from this point forward, archery would very clearly be demonstrated in the history of our nation. King William Rufus dying in a so-called hunting accident with an arrow in his chest in the New Forest, and then Richard the Lionheart being felled by a crossbow bolt.
Being king is a dangerous job. You know, you couldn't be like a modern political leader, you know, or even a recent military commander, you know, 10 miles behind the lines. You had to lead from the front. You had to lead your troops. You had to be therefore in harm's way.
In arrow shot.
You had to be, yes, within the range of a bow.
So Harold might not have been killed by an arrow to the eye, but what's not in doubt is that he lost his life in the battle. And whilst we might not be certain what killed him, there are strong clues pointing to the exact spot where he died.
So, Mark, this is Battle Abbey. It's supposed to demark the site where King Harold was killed. Well, the first thing that struck me the first time I saw this is what a strange place to put a building.
It's a mad place to build an abbey. I mean, that's one of the reasons we think that the story that Harold, this was the spot, the very spot on which Harold died, is actually a true story. Because, well, in the first place, because that story is a contemporary one, it goes right back to the time of Harold and William the Conqueror themselves. And secondly, because as you say, it's a bonkers place to build any building, never mind an abbey, because you can see, looking at this 13th century dormitory range, one end of the basement is about 10 feet high, and by the time you get this end, it's about 30 feet high. It's built on this slope. When the monks were invited to found this abbey here, at some point after the battle, soon after the battle, they initially founded it at the bottom of the hill because that's where there was a water supply. And very quickly, William the Conqueror, this came to William the Conqueror's own ears, and he said, no, you must build it on that very spot, you know, not nearby, not just about, the place where God granted me the victory.
And of course, kings were quite superstitious in a way.
Well, I would go for, it's not just superstition, they are very pious, they're very God-fearing. And when you say, you know, they're God-fearing, he's not just atoning for Harold's death. This site, you know, on the morrow of Hastings, the 15th of October 1066, was thickly strewn with thousands of dead men's bodies. So he's atoning, he's commemorating the victory, but he's also atoning for this massive amount of bloodshed.
It's amazing to think that we're standing on the ground where that all took place.
Yeah, I mean, this everywhere you see here would have been thickly strewn with bodies and you know, awash with blood.
10,000 years after our Mesolithic ancestors carefully placed the Star Carr bow into a lake in Yorkshire, it would be Norman archers invading from across the Channel who'd come to this battlefield to change the course of history.
We'll never know whether King Harold was killed with an arrow in the eye, but one thing I think we can say is that at the battle that was fought in this area, archery entered the psyche of the British nation as a means of waging war. In the coming centuries, bows, arrows, and the men who stood behind them would become a definitive weapon in the armies of Britain.
In the next episode, we're going fully medieval to discover how the bow went from bit part player to the weapon of the age. I'm getting special access to the bows that lay undisturbed for 500 years aboard Henry VIII's ship, the Mary Rose, and I'll visit the scene of one of the bloodiest battles of the Wars of the Roses to see firsthand the damage archers en masse could inflict. There's one type of tree that is synonymous with medieval archery: the yew.
Yew trees grow widely throughout Britain, but really there's nowhere better to see them than here at Kingley Vale National Nature Reserve, which is just north of Chichester in Sussex. This is Europe's largest yew forest. I love yew woods like this. It reminds me of the woodland where I grew up as a boy. Yew trees are special. It wasn't just for making bows. This is a tree that we as a nation have had an incredibly long association with. It's even been suggested that during the Neolithic we may have worshipped under yew trees. And in fact, when I look into the branches of a yew tree, I see the architecture of a cathedral. The branches, the way the light falls through them, even the atmosphere feels like the cloisters of a great natural church or cathedral. It was the tree of life and the tree of death. It's said that if you fall asleep under a yew tree, you'll never wake up. Well, I'm living proof that's not the case. The reason it was so good for the making of bows is the nature of the wood. Here, this lighter wood, this is the outside of the tree, the sapwood, which is strong under tension, while the heartwood, the dark redwood, is strong under compression, so it's naturally laminated, and that was its great advantage.
This natural combination makes yew the perfect spring, providing both the stretch and the power that a bow needs.
The problem is it's very slow growing. These are very ancient trees. They grow incredibly slowly, and our demands for bow wood quickly outstripped the supply of wood available.
And it's this demand that would push us into the next stage of our journey. In part one, we saw how the bow developed from a hunting tool.
In terms of the development of the bow, this is right at the beginning of that period.
To its beginnings as a deadly weapon on the battlefield.
Oh, there's no surgeon of the day could fix that injury.
In this episode, we'll continue our journey into the story of the bow, uncovering how it became the defining weapon of the Middle Ages.
It's known as the bloodiest battle fought on English soil.
And how one incredible discovery has shaped our understanding of the bow's place at the heart of medieval history.
It had become England's main weapon of mass destruction.
Although the bow had been around for a very long while, it's not until the Middle Ages that we start to see the coordinated use of massed archers on the battlefield.
The Middle Ages extends from the 5th to the 15th century. The first written evidence of bows being used en masse in Britain comes from the 11th century. Chronicles record Welsh bowmen inflicting heavy casualties on Anglo-Norman invaders. The Normans must have been impressed. After the conquest of Wales, Welsh archers were recruited into the Anglo-Norman army. But the period in which the bow really came of age was the 100 Years' War. Spanning the 14th and 15th centuries, England and France faced off in a series of brutal battles for territory and riches across the continent. A royal decree ordered that all Englishmen must practice archery. So when the time came, the crown could call on a formidable force of skilled bowmen who had honed their skills roving and at the butts. To explore how archery advanced during this period, I've returned to Todd's workshop to discover how the technologies of the bow and arrow had developed.
So those are great against fabric armour if you sharpen them up. They're great against flesh, of course. But then mail starts to come in, and also fabric armour gets tougher. And so you need to start looking at other things like needle bodkins like this. So that's great arrow from, let's say, 1300.
Terrifying weapon.
Oh, horrific. Because you can see also it doesn't take much of a hole size before you get a long, deep penetration.
Yeah. And piercing wounds are very, very dangerous.
Deep ones, yeah.
Even today, they'd be very dangerous for a surgeon to fix. In those days, fatal.
And then so we now have this one, which is what's commonly called these days a plate cutter, short bodkin, meaning short needle. But now it has a very, very stout, strong
isn't it just
edge. So a bit like a cold chisel. You wouldn't use a fine wood chisel to cut metal, but a coarse cold chisel you can cut metal with. And that's effectively what this is. You are trying to strike the knight hard. You're trying to go through the armour.
And where do we go from here?
It becomes a little difficult, again, to work out what's going on. But we end up with heads like this. So at something like the Battle of Towton, this kind of head would have been absolutely front and foremost of the usage. And it carried on really until the end of the bow. So through, let's say, Flodden in 1513, I think it was, and then through to Mary Rose.
For these heavier arrows, archers would need bows that were strong enough to shoot them. They needed war bows. Our knowledge of this formidable weapon comes largely from the Tudor warship, the Mary Rose. Raised from the Solent in the 1980s, the Mary Rose has revealed a trove of artefacts, including a number of perfectly preserved war bows. These discoveries have given incredible insights into late medieval archery, inspiring Todd and Joe's investigations here today.
So Joe, there's a 76 pound bow, but in medieval times, we know from the Mary Rose that bows were much heavier. Well, what would this one be?
So
this bigger bow?
This is sort of 135, 140 pound draw weight, which is what you need really to shift a heavy arrow to do some damage.
So we're talking about a war bow.
A war bow, yeah, exactly.
And we know from the Mary Rose, the bows that were brought out for that, the average draw weight, I think, was 140 pounds.
Yeah, 140, so that's perfect. Fits in with what my findings have been to shoot a heavy arrow decent weight.
But there were bows on the Mary Rose that were much heavier, 180, 185 pounds draw weight. I mean, monsters.
Yeah, as you say, it's some real big ones which take a long time to learn how to shoot accurately. Years, in fact. So this one's about 160 pounds-ish. So yeah, you've got the real nice flexible sapwood and the nice, hard, compression-resilient belly, heartwood, which makes a perfect belly.
As we had seen previously, there's only one way to determine the true strength of a bow. It's another tense moment for Joe as he tests the heavier war bow.
Wow. 154 pound draw weight.
It's a similar draw weight to those discovered aboard the Mary Rose.
I get big guys who go to the gym all the time who oh, I'll pull that. They literally pull it halfway. They can't do it because their muscles haven't developed in the right way to pull that bow.
It's for these reasons why practice was so important for archers, and might be why Edward I insisted that men forgo all other sports. But of course, it wasn't just the science of attack that was changing, so was the science of defence. And there's one item more that can attest to this: armour.
Could you hold that for me,
Yep.
mate?
Yep.
Squash it in.
Got it.
There we go. So this is a breastplate made by a friend of mine, Ash, and it's representative of one that we would have found Agincourt, a little different to Towton, but not massively different.
It's very strong, isn't it? I mean,
It is very strong. Just push it in because it's a variable thickness, and what it means by that is the threat, of course, comes predominantly from the front. Yeah. And so it's thicker at the front than it is at the sides, and that saves you a bit of weight.
So how thick would it be in the middle of the front?
2.5 millimetres.
2.5 millimetres?
Yeah, something like that on this
Wow.
one.
And is that designed predominantly to resist arrows or other weapons as well? What was the main motivation for that strength?
Well, it certainly is going to be resisting arrows, but of course an awful lot of their combat is going to be on foot to foot against other knights and so on. So really it's a multi-purpose item. Okay. But it is the layering, the composite layer of the armour that helps to defend it against multiple threats. So you've got a padded garment under here, which is not massively thick, but maybe 4, 6, 8 layers. Over that you've got the mail, then over that you've got the breastplate and the rest of the armour, the arms and the legs and everything else. And it's that combination that really helps you to resist the attack.
And this fluting, is that to deflect arrows?
Here, yeah, you can see that fundamentally you've got the neck defences here. What you don't want is arrows hitting and skidding up, ricocheting up under the neck. And so that deflects them away. And again, it's exactly the same on tank armour now, or at least certainly was Second World War. It's exactly the same thing. You do not want the shells coming in just under the turret.
Skipping in, yeah.
Skipping under. So that just sends them away. So it's the same device for hundreds of years has worked.
Grabbing our bows, Joe and I are going to put the armour to the test.
Wow.
Yeah.
The armour worked.
It did.
Broke the arrow.
Low down, yeah.
Ooh.
That is nasty.
Wow, that's really interesting. Now, he's in trouble. He's got 2 injuries here, 3 injuries. But, I mean, despite the strength of this plate armour, you've made a hole in it, which is amazing.
Well, you kind of got 2 things going on. So one, Joe's made a hole through it, which is amazing. You know, arrows, bent piece of wood making holes through sheet steel. You don't imagine that. But then the other thing is the armour has done exactly what it's meant to do. That you've got a bit of deformation, that takes some of the shock out, some of the force. But then also, it hasn't penetrated deeply. Yes, there's a hole there, but it's not a hole that's deep enough for the arrow to pass through and hurt the person inside. So it looks a lot worse than it is. To the guy inside, it's nothing.
Except that you've got a mass of men facing 5,000 archers, firing at, at this range. That would have been just terrifying.
Warbows like Joe's played a decisive role in English victories in the 100 Years' War, but their power wasn't only felt on the battlefields in France.
Just 40 years after the epic Battle of Agincourt, British archers once again drew their bows, but this time the arrows weren't raining down on a foreign enemy. They were landing on brothers, fathers, cousins, in one of our bloodiest civil wars, the War of the Roses.
The Wars of the Roses were one of the bloodiest periods in English history. Fought during the middle of the 15th century and spanning roughly 30 years, the conflict saw brutal battles for control of the English throne, pitching the House of York against the House of Lancaster. One of the bloodiest turning points was the notorious Battle of Towton.
On the 29th of March 1461, just here at Towton, a decisive battle in the War of the Roses was fought. Englishmen against Englishmen, shooting our most deadly weapon, the longbow.
The battle took place in the middle of a snowstorm and is considered to be the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. I've come to meet Chris Berrent, who's going to help me investigate the battlefield and discover where the warbows did the most damage.
So you have 2 armies. You have the army of the anointed and crowned king, Henry VI, and you have an army of Edward IV, who has been acclaimed king in London, but hasn't yet been crowned.
So Henry's the Lancastrians with the red rose, and Edward is the Yorkist with a white rose.
Yes. Okay. And Edward really is the challenger here, so he has to make the running. So he brings his army up from London, acquires more troops coming through the Midlands.
How many troops?
Well, it's debatable. I think at least 10,000 and possibly as many as 25.
Oh, that's a lot of people.
So it's a lot of people. The Lancastrians probably have slightly more. This is an area, and the north as a whole really is an area that is supportive of the Lancastrian house.
So this is their home turf?
Yes.
So everything's easier for them in terms of supply,
Yep.
local support,
Yep.
and I guess they get the opportunity to choose the ground perhaps.
Well, we think so. And in choosing this ground, you have very strong military advantages. You're on the high ground, you're dominating the road, the other side of the road is marshland and fenland, and so you're protected on that side. No one can bring an army through there. And beyond the marsh, you have the River Wharfe. On the other side, you have the River Cockbeck, so you have both your flanks protected. And it's a fairly narrow spit of land on the high ground. The Yorkists move up and deploy here. Well, 2/3 of those are probably archers.
Amazing.
And only a third are the professionals and the billmen.
I mean, it just shows you the regard with which archery was held as a weapon of war.
It had become England's main weapon of mass destruction.
In many ways, it was the machine gun of its age.
It was. The way the battle starts, Yorkist commander Lord Falkenberg, he's noticed the wind has switched into the south, into their backs. So he takes his archers forward a bit and he starts launching volleys of arrows into the Lancastrian forces. They do respond, their archers respond, but they are inconvenienced by the wind and can't see as well because of the snow.
When the Yorkist archers ran out of ammunition, they stepped forward, collected the Lancastrian arrows and shot them back. Realising they couldn't just stand there, the Lancastrian commanders gave the order to charge. Hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat ensued, but eventually, with fresh reinforcements arriving, the Yorkists were able to break the lines of the Lancastrian army. In their attempt to save their lives, the remaining Lancastrians fled for a valley just to the west of the battlefield. It's here where thousands were cut down by the pursuing Yorkist troops.
Well, it's really interesting. So in the distance, tall tree, that's where the Yorkists were on that slope.
Yep.
And they're forced, aren't they? They're funneled by the battle down into this defile. You can actually see this as a gap in the horizon that forced people down. What happened then?
So essentially they emerge, but what they emerge onto is a lake. The Cockbeck River coming through here floods.
It comes all the way through.
And it meanders through, but that whole area in front of us would just be water. So you're tired, you've fought for however many hours, and you're emerging into this lake of water, and you've got to try and get across.
So is this a fighting withdrawal or is this a rout?
No, this is a rout.
Oh.
This is a rout.
So this is the worst possible situation.
Absolutely.
Need I ask what happened?
Many die. The accounts that have survived to us, which I think we have to take with a certain pinch of salt, talk about between 28,000 and 36,000 dead, most of them Lancastrian. I think that's questionable because of the size of the population and the size of armies and so forth, but it will have been a terrible, ghastly scene down there with men being forced into the water. You'll have had potentially archers up here if they still have ammunition shooting down into them. You'll have had men making sure they keep going. Men will have fallen into the water. They will have drowned.
An awful situation.
Yeah.
You know, you really can't beat walking the battlefield. You have the luxury of seeing the ground from every perspective, something that the combatants themselves didn't have. And this really is a battle that's all about the high ground. You have two armies facing each other on promontories, but one manages to goad the other to give up the possession of high ground by the supreme use of their archer force. But honestly, I can't think of anything worse than two medieval English armies facing each other, both with large forces of archers. It was brutal.
Remarkably, some of the remains of the men who fought at Towton were discovered in a mass grave. They're being studied just a few miles away at the University of Bradford. I've come to meet Dr. Joe Buckberry to see what these men's skeletons can tell us about the carnage archers could inflict.
These individuals were buried from a mass grave. It was excavated back in 1996, and we have the remains of 38 people who died at the Battle of Towton. All show evidence of how they died very violently in that conflict. and they also tell us more about the individuals and how they live their lives as well.
It's no longer just a field when you start to see human remains. It's a place where real people...
It's real people, and the level of casualties at Towton's immense. It's known as the bloodiest battle fought on English soil. We don't know for certain how many people did actually die at Towton, and relatively few of them have ever been found through excavation, and this is the largest group.
So, tell me about this skull here.
So, this individual is Towton 21, and he was aged between about 25 and 35 when he died at Towton. What's particularly interesting, we can see we've got evidence of a sword injury on the side of the skull, really quite substantial.
Horrific,
but of particular interest to you, I think, is this very small hole on the back of the skull. So this is right up, sort of around the hairline level. By looking at the different medieval weapons that we have at the Royal Armouries, this has been identified as being a armour-piercing arrow.
It's square cross-section.
Yeah, it's square cross-section. It's slightly rectangular, but that could be due to mass production isn't always perfect when you're doing it all by hand.
Wow, so could this have killed him as well?
Possibly. It depends what it did to the soft tissue on the inside. So a small hole in the skull isn't a huge problem, but that's there to protect your brain. So really it's the brain injuries that are the particularly dangerous side of this.
Whilst we can't say for certain which side these men fought on, the arrow wounds suggest that they were part of the Lancastrian army, perhaps fleeing the Yorkist archers.
And so how did this person die, do you know?
Yeah, again, we've got evidence of trauma on this individual. I think the one that you're, again, particularly interested in is this hole in here, which you know is from a flesh-piercing arrow.
Yeah,
and actually, you can see it's quite
kind of
big.
Round with it's like wings,
blades
to it, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can picture the arrowhead that would have done that injury, and that would have gone quite deep in.
Yeah, I mean, apparently it would have gone almost up to the skirt of the arrow, very, very deep penetrating injury. So obviously that's going to have ramifications as to what's happening with the soft tissue, because that's also going to be penetrating into brain tissue.
Yeah.
But the skeletons don't just tell us how these men died. They can also tell us a little bit about how they lived. Recent scientific research suggests that archery practice contributed to a high prevalence of a condition known as ossa chromiale. Evidence of this, the detaching of small bones at the end of the shoulder blades, has been found in a large number of skeletons from this period, including some of those from Towton.
So if you look at this scapula here on the right side, this is what we know as the little separate part that separates. This is the os acromiale, and what you can see is they fit together, and you've got this false joint surface between the two. So this is pulled away and healed over.
And remained in situ.
And remained in situ.
So this potentially could be somebody who's trained with the use of a bow from childhood?
Potentially, there's likely to be some kind of a genetic weakness that predisposes certain people to getting this particular injury, and it's thought that strenuous activity in the shoulder can exacerbate it and then increase the likelihood of somebody getting it, and archery is one of the many things that could do that. We know that there is more evidence of ossa chromiale at Towton than we see in other medieval populations.
That was incredible. The thought that some of those skeletons belonged to archers is special. But I guess the thing that I'm really left with is the sense of the extreme violence that led to their deaths that snowy day in 1461.
The Wars of the Roses was a high watermark in the story of the bow. Soon, battlefields would be filled with the sounds of gunpowder and small arms as cannons became the weapons of choice. The days of the bow were numbered, but they weren't over, not just yet. To see this evidence, I've come to one of the most famous shipwrecks in the world, the Mary Rose. The Mary Rose was a veteran of many campaigns, having served Tudor kings for 33 years. And it would be fighting in another Anglo-French war that would see her luck finally run out. Sinking off the coast of England in 1545, the Mary Rose claimed the lives of nearly 500 crew members and lay undisturbed for over 400 years before she was raised in a daring feat of marine archaeology. I've come to meet a member of the team who was involved in the raising of the Mary Rose, Dr. Alex Hildred.
Wow, this is amazing. I mean, to stand here this close is really special. It feels like time travel. So what do we know about how the ship sank?
Well, what we do know, because we found the archaeological evidence, is that all of the gun ports, both on the starboard side and the port side, all the lids were open and hinged above them. She goes out of the fleet, and we've got a very good image of that. We call it the Cowdray engraving, but it's the encampment of the King's forces at Portsmouth. And you see that the flagship, the Henry Grassager, is engaging the French galleys. The Mary Rose has come out from behind her, because the rest of them are sort of in a wedge formation behind, and fired the guns on her starboard side as she goes over, and then turns and sinks.
So she's turning then to the port?
She's turning to port. Why she did it, whether the ship was slightly sluggish, whether she'd been hit earlier in the morning by French gunfire, we don't know. The French actually say that they sank her.
But if she was sunk, then any damage that would have caused that would have been on the side of the ship that's now missing.
That's right. And so we have crawled over the side of the ship looking for battle damage. There is absolutely nothing, but you're right. It would be on the side that's missing.
When a battleship comes back to port, the first thing they do is take everything off and fix it up. What's unique about the Mary Rose is that she was engaged in combat, so you had everything on board that a warship would have at the peak of its operation.
Absolutely, and we have an inventory for all of the vessels within the King's fleet, and you can tick off the things, and so this is an inventory of what she should be if she was fully functional, and we can tick off archaeologically all of the, virtually all of those things.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The artefacts preserved in this tragedy would help revolutionise our understanding of Tudor archery. Amongst the cannons and small arms discovered were hundreds of war bows.
So we're now in the reserve collection of the museum, where we're storing some of the longbows that aren't on display.
Oh my God, look at that. That is amazing. You've just opened the door to a medieval bowyer's workshop.
These are all from one chest in the lower deck, so they were in store, which is why they're in such light condition. They haven't taken up any colour from the sediments because they've been protected by the elm chests.
They look like new.
They do, don't they?
They're, what, 500 years old?
Well, nearly.
But what fascinates me is they're bending away from the string.
The reverse curve shows that these are reflex bows. Their arms bend away from the archer when unstrung, allowing the bow to be put under greater strength when the string is attached, meaning they can be shorter but still retain the same draw weight as their full-length counterparts. Perfect for the confined spaces of a ship. But not all of the bows were found stored in boxes. A handful were discovered loose, suggesting they might have been in use only seconds before the Mary Rose sank.
This, by difference, are some of the ones that were found loose, as opposed to they fell out of chests, perhaps on the upper deck. And you can see immediately the different coloration, and some of them are actually damaged. That was obviously broken, and we've glued it back together again. But that bend there is probably where, within compression within the sediments.
This looks like it was strung.
This
one was strung with the string when the ship went down.
There are some.
That's a strong bow. You know, this was probably in the hand of an archer at the time the ship went down.
Amazingly, nearly 500 years later, the maker's marks, the signature of the men who crafted these bows for Henry VIII, are still clearly visible.
Oh, yeah.
Can you see?
Yes.
So the edge of it.
Little points being put in.
There's another.
Yeah, there's the maker's mark there. The bowyer, maybe.
The Mary Rose bows provide incredible evidence of the true role of archery in Tudor warfare.
When I started to make bows, most of the literature that described the English longbow based opinions on Victorian target bows, which are toys by comparison to these bows. It was only when this weight of evidence turned up, it was undeniable. Here was a light on true medieval archery. It's amazing.
Well, the Mary Rose is amazing because you've got things, these weapons that were used out of wood next to the newest bronze guns that were, you know, the last one was cast in 1543. So, and it was, you know, with huge expense to produce, to cast 3 tons of metal, molten metal, and cast these guns. And here we have simple sticks.
I mean, it's fantastic to see. What an incredible collection.
11,000 years in the making, this is where our story of archery ends.
This has been an incredible journey for me, somewhat emotional. I didn't know how it would feel to string my bow after an absence of 20 years. I didn't even know if the bow would survive, but it has, and it's reminded me that I really should use it more often. And then there's the history, seeing those incredible longbows recovered from the Mary Rose, 500 years old, and yet they look as though they were made yesterday. Or the Mesolithic archery from North Yorkshire, Britain's first usherings of archery. In the UK, the longbow has a special significance within our folklore. It's part of our national character. I've not found anything like that anywhere else in the world.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.